Lexington expanding its urban service boundary is asking a judge to stop the committee that is working to identify land that would be added for development. The Fayette Alliance is asking Judge Lucy Van Meter to stop the group from deciding which areas would be included in the up to 5,000 acres to be added to the city's growth boundaries. The Herald Leader reports the group says such an expansion requires analysis, planning, and projections that have not been done. The city is not commenting on that court filing. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has temporarily paused his Republican presidential campaign to remain in Florida and deal with the incoming hurricane. DeSantis had originally planned campaign stops, including in the early primary state of South Carolina. Reports say his wife Casey attended a South Carolina event in his behalf. Ironically, DeSantis is having to coordinate his state's response with President Joe Biden, the man he hopes to succeed after next year's elections. Back in Kentucky, Corbin Mayor Susie Rasmus is serving notice that local police will be going after stores that sell vaping products to minors. The News-Journal reports the City Commission heard from the local health department this week about the prevalence of vaping by youth. State law requires people to be 21 years old to buy any tobacco products.
Hi everybody, it is a really nice weather day here in Lexington, north and west of us, farther to the south and east. Okay, it's not quite as nice. Live view into downtown Lexington with that mix of sun and some clouds showing up. Let's roll into Wednesday, middle of the week, feels like fall. Okay, September version of fall, mid and late September, 50s in the morning, upper 70s into the afternoon. Sun